everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank Nilgiris Caves for such a great initiative. And uh, I'm going to talk about some of my PhD work to set the context. The work that I did with Dr. Mahesh Shankaran and Jay Shri Ratnam. Yeah. Uh, I'm going to talk about just to introduce Shola grassland mosaics where I work. So just to briefly introduce Shola grassland mosaics, uh, uh, Shola grassland mosaics are, we all know that most of them are found in higher elevation in the Western Ghats, and their peculiar characteristics is abrupt transition between forest and grassland. We all know that they are known for high biological diversity as well as high endemism. And these Shola grassland mosaic landscapes were once widespread. And in the Nilgiris or on the Nilgiri Plateau also, these Shola grassland mosaic landscapes were inhabited by some of the tribes, mainly Vadagas, Todas, Kota, and Irula tribes. And they were living in harmony with these forest grassland landscapes. But things began to change with the beginning of 19th century. In 1818, British officials kind of discovered Shola grassland mosaic landscapes in the Nilgiris. And they found that the pleasant weather and cool weather here might be useful for the speedy recovery of their injured soldiers. So they decided to build a sanatorium on the Nilgiri Plateau, and they soon began to build roads and buildings. So this is St. Stephen Church, one of the first buildings built by British on the Nilgiri Plateau, which is still standing next door to Common Club. Slowly, the population began to increase on the plateau, and to meet the increasing demand of railwood, British officials decided to plant native species first on the grassland. And they started with native species, but the native species plantations miserably failed. So they started introducing some of the exotic species on the grassland. And the first were acacia and eucalyptus. Some of the acacia and eucalyptus species thrived, but their growth was not very satisfactory. Around the same time, British officials started to believe that these forest grassland mosaics, the grasslands of these mosaics, are an outcome of indiscriminate uh, fire and grazing by local communities. And therefore, they thought that it is important to restore these grasslands back to forests. And that with that objective, during colonial period, they introduced around more than 35 exotic tree species on these grasslands. Of these 35 species, many plantations failed. Some around 16 exotic species survived, and some of them turned invasive, especially the Acacia mearnsii turned invasive and started spreading on remnant grasslands. By the end of colonial rule, an Indian forest official, Ranganathan, he argued that it may not be fire as a primary driver of this Shola grassland, but it could be the incidence of frost that occurs in the grassland during winter. And that governs the forest grassland distribution on these plateaus. But despite that, even in independent India, the convergence of grasslands to plantations continued unabated, and in fact, the extent of convergence in independent India was multifold compared to the convergence during colonial period. Just to give an example, around 5,000 acres were converted during colonial period, but by the end of 20th century in independent India, the conversion was around 32,000 acres. But rest of it's just plantations on public land, but equal amount or more than that grasslands were converted into tea plantations, tea and eucalyptus plantations as well. So these conversions had severe impact on biodiversity, groundwater table, and livelihoods. This grave ecological mismanagement we are talking about, and which the extent of this damage can be seen with this the image of Saint Stephen Church, which was built in 1820. So this is a picture image from 1834. We can see that by 1850s, the same Stephen Church, now there are some plantations coming up. By the beginning of 20th century, almost all grasslands are converted into the plantations of exotic species. And this is how the St. Stephen Church looks today. So this can be attributed to mis- misunderstanding the ecology of this Shola grassland ecosystems and our obsession with trees. And the Nilgiri Plateau is not just one example. This misconception that grasslands are wasteland we can see across the globe, and some of the unique fragile grasslands have been converted to plantations or so-called forests. So these are some of the lessons we can learn from the historical ecological mismanagement. So while these convergence were happening, on one hand, on the other hand, there was debate going on what maintains this forest grassland mosaics. Uh, Colonial era, the hypothesis was it's fire that maintains that restrict native tree establishment on grassland and thereby maintain this mosaic. Ranganathan and then Mehromji and some other ecologists argued that it could be the frost that might be maintaining the forest grassland mosaics. There was also argument about soil, that differences in soil properties that's maintaining the soil grassland, forest grassland mosaic. We carried out series of field experiments to understand what exactly governs this forest grassland distribution. So specifically, we try to understand what are the factors or drivers that restrict native tree establishment on grassland, but allow or do not limit the invasive Acacia mearnsii invasion on the same grassland. So we focused on early life history stages of these native and exotic trees, especially Acacia mearnsii, and some of the common native trees there. So we carried out survey and found that yes, these seeds of these species are being dispersed on grassland. We carried out germination trials and we found that yes, seeds of native as well as exotic acacia do germinate on grassland. But when we monitored seedling survival of native and exotic trees, uh, we found that seedlings do not survive, especially in winter. The native seedlings incur very high mortality. And therefore, we decided to focus on seedling survival in winter on grassland in these mosaics. So we all know that during winter, sometimes temperature drops down below zero on this plateau and frost occurs. So we decided to carry out a field experiment where we can test the survival with frost and what's the survival of seedlings when we protect them from freezing temperature and frost. So one set of seedlings was exposed to freezing temperature and frost during winter, and other set was protected from nighttime freezing temperature and frost using thermal blankets. And what we found is these are graphs. So on y-axis you can see survival probability here. This blue line shows uh, survival of native tree seedlings. We can see that when this control is basically when seedlings were exposed to freezing temperature and frost, and we can see that seedlings incur very high mortality during winter, especially after occurrence of frost events. Those blue dots you see are frost occurrences. So once the frost occurs, seedlings incur very high mortality, especially native tree seedlings. Whereas when we protect the native tree seedlings from frost, their survival goes up to almost 40%. So that clearly shows that it's frost and freezing temperature that primarily is a bottleneck for their establishment on the grasslands. Whereas the red line shows survival of invasive acacia. We can see that they have a significantly higher survival compared to native trees, even though they were exposed to frost and freezing temperature. And when they were protected from frost and freezing temperature, their survival went up to 90%. This this study clearly shows that the frost is uh, the existence of grasslands on the Nilgiri Plateau is primarily governed by climate, especially freezing temperature and frost. And the increase in temperature, especially the lowering the probability of occurrence of frost, may promote the expansion of Shola or native tree expansion on grassland, but also it can amplify the Acacia invasion. Why this understanding this vegetation dynamics is important? As we saw, it want to I mean better understanding of ecology is always important, as we saw in our historical misperception and ecological mismanagement, that assuming fire, indiscriminate fire and grazing, that's causing the existence of grassland, that led to the disastrous management on this plateau, which led to destruction. Almost more than 80% of grasslands now we have already lost because of such misperception about the uh, grassland. And so this misperception about grassland need to be we need to come out of this, and we should consider the grasslands itself are themselves are unique ecosystems, and we need to better understand the drivers of these ecosystems. Uh, and we also saw that these grasslands were managed for centuries by local communities. So it would be important to integrate local community management system with scientific knowledge to enable sustainable management of these mosaics. Thank you.